So as mentioned, I'm Jason. I'm a technical evangelist at Datadog, which means that I get to travel around the world and give talks. And oftentimes I talk about food and drink and have these talks that have very little relevance to DevOps. So it made me wonder, why did the fine organizers of this wonderful conference choose my talk? And it's probably because I mentioned whiskey in my proposal, or it could be because they were drinking whiskey when they were reviewing the proposals. I think it's probably the latter. But either way, whiskey is the reason for this talk, particularly these 4 fine whiskeys were involved in the writing of this talk, so I do apologize if this is not the talk that you expected, but it gives me a chance to talk about my favorite thing, whiskey. I do like whiskey. I particularly like the stories and the history and the lore around whiskey. So I have 3 lessons that you should all ponder and try to adapt as you go along your DevOps journey, and I'm going to use whiskey to illustrate them. And the first lesson is that you have to experiment. There's no way to improve your processes unless you're changing them, and in order to change them in intentional ways, you have to experiment. So my favorite experiment actually happened in 2012, when Trey Zeller, who is the co-founder of Jefferson's Bourbon, was hanging out with a friend of his on a boat, and he started thinking about how does whiskey age in barrels. Well, the fun thing, he decided to do an experiment and do something crazy. So he took 5 barrels of bourbon, put them on his friend's boat. That boat sailed around the world doing biological research on sharks. It traveled 10,000 nautical miles. It went through the Panama Canal 6 times. And in the end, he ended up with a fantastic whiskey. They called it Jefferson's Ocean. Rapidly aged that whiskey. And so, the advice is continue to experiment with your processes. Try something crazy out there that you may not expect the results. All that said, no good DevOps talk is complete without a Docker reference. So I'm happy to say that Jefferson's Bourbon is widely available. The company now actually regularly fills containers full of bourbon barrels and sells them around the world. Container technology. Point number 2, you have to measure everything. If you're going to start experimenting with your processes, you have to measure in order to know if you're successful or not. Now, there's some dispute as to who invented whiskey, whether it's the Irish or the Scots. We all know the actual answer to that. But at the beginning of the 19th century, the Scots and the Irish were producing about the same amount of whiskey. And it wasn't until 1830 that a fabulous man named Aeneas Coffey invented the coffee still, a type of continuous still. And the Scots quickly adopted this technology while the Irish didn't. And we know the final result of that because the Scots now are the #1 producer of whiskey in the world, whereas the Irish are not. But most people don't realize that this was actually part of Coffey's idea to measure every single part of the whiskey making production. Because with a continuous still, you can measure the inputs and you can measure the outputs, and you can understand how your systems work. So measure everything. The third point that I want to make is that you have to embrace failure. If you're going to experiment, you're going to fail. So William Grant & Sons, fine makers of spirits like Glenfiddich and Balvenie, they've done a lot of experimentation around how you make whiskey and how you run distilleries. And so a while back, they started experimenting with bioreactors. They started gathering CO2 from the fermentation process in order to turn it into energy. But when told that the technology was too new and it would just fail, Charles Grant Gordon, who's the president of the company at the time, said, "I want you to do it because you will fail. You will fail and you will learn. And you'll try again and you'll fail and you'll learn more. And by the time the technology is ready, you'll learn to do it well." And I think this quote embodies the spirit of what we're trying to do within the DevOps movement, what people are trying to do when they adopt DevOps, and that's to learn and to continuously improve, because we all know that the technology won't always be ready. So just to recap, 3 lessons for you. Number 1, experiment with your processes. There's no way to improve unless you're intentionally making changes to them. In order to know if you're successful, then, is point 2. You absolutely have to measure everything in your processes and how you're doing. It's the only way to know if you're successful or how to actually start to tweak those processes to improve them. And when you do make these changes, you will inevitably fail, so embrace failure. If you're too afraid to fail, you'll never properly experiment. You'll never learn from your failures, and you'll never improve your processes or your teams. Thanks.